Hey, story time. Story time. Yeah, lapdog. All right, story time. You want to hear a story? You're not going to stay here long enough to hear this whole story. Hey everybody, how you doing? Steve the Amateur Historian here with my pooch. We're all dealing with the quarantine. We're probably not enjoying it that much, but we're still here and we're still going. Anyway, I have a fresh story for you. Again, something based on a random article that I'd stumbled onto. That kind of was a representation for a lot of kind of stories that were going on around this time and place, of just kind of women disappearing under interesting circumstances. All right, you want to run off? Yeah, you're already bored. She'd rather go around sniffing at things than hear what I have to tell you. But this is kind of another one of those videos where it's just kind of, you look at how we deal with things now, or at least the more present day, the last 30 years or whatever, compared to how things were addressed, how people behaved under certain comparable circumstances at a whole other time. And in this case, I'm talking about the concept of people who, particularly young people, underage people under the age of 18, who go missing under whatever circumstances, and kind of how those things will go about, or I guess went about, differently than how they would today. I have a dog tail growing out of my arm. Yes. She's just sniffing around. So, while I was, again, doing some of my historic murders of Portland investigation work, I stumbled upon a simple story that said, like, was she kidnapped? That was essentially like the bulk of the headline. And so immediately I was like, huh. And I started looking into it, trying to find more. I could find no more than this one article, because I was thinking, if I go from this point, it was an article from the February 27th, 1922 issue of the Oregon Daily Journal is where this particular article came from, acknowledging that a young woman had vanished under some circumstances. So I took that point and kept searching beyond that, like after February 27th, to see if I could find any more about this woman, to see if maybe she was kidnapped, maybe she was the victim of this or that, maybe she was a murder victim, who knows. And I never found another article besides this one article. And this one article was left very ambiguous because at the time of its publishing, we didn't know what had happened. And essentially, the story is, it's the evening of February 25th, 16-year-old Beatrice Wright comes home with her mother shortly before midnight. And I believe they lived at the corner of Grand Avenue and Schuyler Street, which, if you live in Portland, you know that kind of Grand Avenue and Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard run side by side, and eventually the further north you go, Grand Avenue does this, and they merge as one. Well, the last street right before they merge is Schuyler that crosses. It's very commercial. It's mostly kind of boring warehouse buildings there now, but that used to be a lot more residential, and that's where the Wrights lived. So they come home, again, February 25th, a little bit before midnight. All seems to be normal. Beatrice goes to bed around 1 a.m., so it's now the following day, February 26th, Sunday. And, all they know is that Beatrice went to bed. Following morning, she doesn't go down for breakfast, and her mother goes upstairs, goes into her bedroom, and sees that her 16-year-old daughter, Beatrice, is no longer there. Her window was open, the screen on the window had been jimmied with, and the mother, obviously concerned immediately, where's my daughter? She saw that her daughter's diary had been left open and scrawled in very broken English, that literally, the way it's written, it's hard to say exactly what type of, at least, what nationality the person had come from, who had obviously learned some English, but still only had learned it to the point that it was kind of broken. And in this note that had been sketched in her diary, and then the diary left open, obviously for someone in the house to ultimately stumble upon, it said, and I quote, We are taking your girl away. You do not look for girl, for if you do look for girl, we kill girl in mean way. So you're getting the broken English there. If you stay way, yeah, they say way instead of away. If you stay away, we treat girl good. She have everything that rich girl have, maybe more. And they misspelled maybe. We be good if you stay away. All we want is girl to keep our home and cook for me. And that's really all that they had to go on, was the initial idea is that somebody, obviously probably a recent immigrant to the Portland area, had broken in and kidnapped Beatrice. Why they would just pick her of all the random people in the world to break into their house and kidnap her and essentially use her as a forced cook and maid or whatever, who's to say? But that was obviously the impression being given at the start, that she was abducted by, some probably recently relocated immigrant in Portland who probably hadn't been in America that long or hadn't learned much of the English language in the time that they had been here. So the family, of course, understandably contacts the authorities. Very quickly they show up. They, find, obviously, the window was open, but they found no evidence on the outside of the house around Beatrice Wright's window that somebody had forced their way in. It seemed like whatever happened, either, Beatrice Wright opened the window herself. And there was nothing astray. The bedding, Beatrice Wright's bedding was the only thing that was astray in the room, and that's understandable. Other than her diary being open, there was no signs of a struggle. There was no, her parents had the room right next to her and heard nothing through the night. Didn't hear any conversations, didn't hear a scuffle, didn't even hear the windows being open. There was no sign that anything had happened. And the only footprints they could find outside of the house, in the vicinity of where you'd have to go to get to Beatrice Wright's window, the only footprints they found were from women's shoes. Now, can we rule out entirely that a man would show up in women's shoes, that he would think that far to abduct her, or maybe a woman abducted her? But the fact that they only found prints from a woman's shoe, and it seemed like it was only one pair of shoes, indicated, again, further that she probably wasn't abducted from her home, and that, if anything, that was probably just Beatrice Wright's own footprints. So, despite this note in broken English that had been left there, authorities started determining fairly quickly, at least in their perspective, that Beatrice Wright had left on her own. And aside from the evidence in the state of her room, one of the reasons that they thought this further was they went through her diary more. I think it started, obviously they wanted to see if they could find any clues, but also furthermore they wanted to compare the writing on the, abduction note, or whatever you want to call it, to see if it could be matched to Beatrice Wright's own writing that would occur in the rest of her diary. And they noticed that the writing was different, but that certain letters were done in a similar fashion between how she normally wrote and how this note was written, so they kind of were 50-50 on whether she did it or not, but were kind of the opinion that she probably just tried to alter her handwriting in some way to make it look like somebody else did it. But as they went through her diary, they discovered written pieces about an individual by the name, they only give the name Howard. Beatrice's family or parents, and none of them had any clue who this Howard was. There apparently wasn't even a last name given in the diary. He was just this mysterious Howard, of whom the young Beatrice had obviously, based on her writings, become very enamored of. I don't know if they found any vindication that they actually had started dating or started getting serious with each other. Again, this one article I found, the only thing it implicated was that his name was in her diary, and she was obviously had taken an interest in him, but it hadn't really gone beyond that in terms of her writings. And maybe she intentionally kept it that way because she didn't want maybe her parents to know what would happen. And so the police, when all was said and done, were of the opinion that Beatrice left her room on her own and probably met with Howard to potentially elope in some way. That was kind of the general conclusion, or at least the theory that was being played with at this time. And again, that's how the article ends, and I didn't find any other articles. And at this time, because this is the 1920s, newspapers were very big. I notice this becomes less and less of a thing further on you go into time, the closer you get to today. But it was very common, if there was a missing person, if there was any kind of wild, dramatic instance, that there could be an update made for. The newspaper would publish it, even if it was a short article. So had Beatrice Wright been found, had she been returned to her home, had she been found to have run off and married this Howard guy, the newspapers would have posted something about it. Again, it may have been a small article, but they would have posted something about it. And I found nothing. And I searched, like, a 10-year period after this article came out, just to see if there was anything about Beatrice Wright, anything about a Howard, anything about both of them, anything about a runaway girl, missing girl. Couldn't find anything. So we're left a little bit in limbo. Like, logistically, you look at the information, you think, yeah, that seems like she left on her own. But there's still lingering questions, like, why would she do it this way? Now, obviously, she was underage. But it was more accepted back then that women under the age of 18 might get married. I mean, not if you're like 8, but 16, 17-year-old women got married, got plans to get married. That happened all the time. We don't know. We don't have any information really about this Harold. Was he potentially, or Howard, was he potentially a sketchy character? Was he maybe involved in some stuff that Beatrice thought her parents would be like, no, we forbid you to see this boy? We don't know that either. And so it's just interesting to me that in a home that apparently was normal, functioning, there wasn't any signs that there was headbutting between Beatrice and her family. There was nothing that suggested she would want to run away. This seemed like a normal family with a nice home, and Beatrice Wright was just another girl. So why would she run away and then seemingly, it almost seems like, not return? We don't know if she ever came back or if she was ever found. So there's so many questions that still linger with the story, even though it seems like there's a general idea as to what happened, but we don't know why this would happen, why she would do this, why, and furthermore, why she would, if she wanted to run away and never be found, wouldn't she just leave? Or leave a note for her parents that says, like, I'm leaving, this is my decision, I'm old enough to do this, I'm running away, and don't ever come looking for me, and then not leave them any information to know where to find her at any given point. But instead she leaves this message in broken English, which, by all accounts, the rest of her diary wasn't like this. She knew perfect English. So why she would decide to write a note in broken English, essentially saying that she'd been abducted by someone and was being used essentially for, like, manual labor. Like, if I was that parent, that note would make me more vigilantly look for my daughter. Like, oh my God, what kind of circumstances is she under? Even with the letter saying no, that just seems so dark for someone who, again, seems to have come from a family where there didn't seem to be anything wrong, to write this note that says, we've taken your girl, and to imply that if you look for her, she's going to get killed. Like, to go to those depths, to literally fake a note and say, don't come looking for me or I will get killed. Like, that's dark. That implies a very strong desire to get away from your family and never be found. And we don't know why Beatrice Wright would want to do that. But it's so strange, because nowadays, again, kind of coming back to more contemporary times, the fact that, we still have runaways all the time. And runaways, believe it or not, were actually a lot more frequent back in the old days. But parents, there was a lot of broken homes, a lot of transients, and a lot of, again, it's kind of similar today, but a lot of kids would run away and then come back home when they realized they couldn't make it on the streets on their own. But, in this time we're living in, it's, people just run away now. And a lot of them aren't that great at it. And they're not usually running away because they're going to elope. Some run away because they found a boyfriend that they think their parents aren't going to like. But a lot of them just run away because they hate their home life. And, unfortunately, a lot of them will ultimately end up being young people stuck living on the streets. But it's interesting because this is just one example in a lot of cases, even just out of Portland, of kids or people under the age of 18. disappearing. And, you know, nowadays, like, usually we're pretty good at figuring out really quick whether this was a runaway, that was a runaway, this is a runaway. A lot of these cases, they were a lot more difficult to crack because it was like a lot more time was put into setting up. Again, if Beatrice Wright set this all up, you know, she went to the depths of writing a fake abduction note that she thought ahead of time to write in broken English to probably lead their parents and the police astray. Like, that's not very common now. Nowadays, people are just like, F you, I'm leaving home, and then they walk out. They don't even try to hide it. Because nowadays, you know, people are a lot more free to kind of do what they want and say what they want. So, you know, 15-year-old kid could say, hey, F you, parents, I'm done with you, I'm leaving, try to stop me. Back in the day, you know, even when people were doing things like this, like running away and eloping, or running away from home, or doing things that were incredibly taboo, there was still like this, it was like they acknowledged it as kind of this dishonorable thing to do, so they would put time into formulating it to alter it. And that may have been in the end why she wrote this note, was because she didn't want to deal with the shame, or for her family to be shamed of her being an underage girl running off and eloping with someone, because that stuff was kind of frowned on back in the day. So you create this letter that implies she's abducted, and then suddenly it's the parents don't have to have any shame because the daughter, at least as far as they know, did no wrong. So there's just a lot of differences in how runaways do it today. Obviously, with how runaways did it almost 100 years ago. This is a case from 1922, so this case happened 98 years ago. So it's always interesting, you know, a lot of your personal, especially if you're someone like me, someone my age, this time and place, it's just very interesting, you know, when most of what you know is based in the world that you grew up in. So when you go back and find these stories of things happening to people that still happen today, such as people running away from home, or people being potentially kidnapped from home, and you see it, and you see how it went down, you realize this is so interesting to me because this is so different from how I know these things usually go down in the world that I live in. And that's one of the things that makes history so awesome, is that you get to, the more you know about a certain time in history, the more you become inundated and educated in the fact of how people were different and how people change over time. There's all these things coming together. And on that rambling note, I should probably slow down because the sun is beginning to hit my camera, as I'm sure you're noticing, these light shines coming down. But that's it. I just thought this was an interesting story to me because it seems so obvious by the end that this girl ran away for whatever reason. But there's still some things that are strange and peculiar about it. So, you know, initially I was like 100% certain, or let's say 99. I'm never 100% certain about anything. I was like 99% certain she ran off on her own. Now I'm like 93% certain she ran off on her own. But it looks like we shall never know. Either because she disappeared and was just never found again, or because the newspapers didn't do a good job of acknowledging it when she did return, or was found, or whatever. So if that's the case, that's on the newspapers. That ain't on me. So thank you so much for watching in this time of quarantine. Remember to like, share, subscribe. What's going on over here? Remember to like, share, subscribe, hit up my Patreon if you so choose. And again, stay safe and be smart out there. Until next time, this has been Steve, the Amateur Historian.